Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome. I'm here with a VR to my friend Imogen over at Sapling Tarot and their tag, Tarot Ethics. I will link Imogen's video in the description box below. This is a tag that, of course, focuses on tarot ethics. There are 18 questions. I feel like this is very predominantly a tag for those of us who, in some capacity or another, read for other people, whether that be family and friends, or whether that be, in public events or selling readings online or whatever it might be. A lot of these ethical questions, I think, are not necessarily as salient if your practice consists of readings for yourself exclusively. So unless I mention otherwise, we'll just say going forward that I'm talking about tarot ethics in the context of reading for other people, whether that be for friends, just kind of freely, or whether that be as a paid service. I have read and do read at public events at times. So in that context, I'm reading for strangers and am accepting money for that. I also read for family and friends here and there when it comes up. So those are the kinds of experiences that I'm going to be speaking from. I'm going to try not to ramble forever. There are some questions in here that Imogen labeled quickfire, and I don't quickfire, but I'm going to try to be relatively concise. I haven't written down answers or brainstormed answers ahead of time because obviously if you're talking about your ethics, that's not really something in my mind that you should have to be thinking about ahead of time to make a video, because it's the thing that you're doing, right? It's how you navigate, your practice and what you're doing already. So that should be something, to be able to speak to without too much forethought, right? Because the forethought has presumably already happened. So without further ado, I will timestamp the questions below. Question 1. Do you predict the future, and or do you tell people that you predict the future? How do you explain this? So I will say, in terms of how do I explain this, I've never been put in a position reading for other people, whether publicly or for friends, where I was pressed to explain the kind of mechanic of how or why I think that predicting the future can work. So I've never had to, explain that. I don't feel the need to say too much about it in practice most of the time. I absolutely do predict the future. If asked, I absolutely will tell people that I will. And if asked to explain that, I think I could go a couple of different routes. I do definitely have a more faded perspective on the future, I would say, than is necessarily commonplace. I don't not believe in agency or anything like that. Of course, I do believe that we as humans have agency and can change our circumstances and can make decisions that matter. I believe that is true and that is important. I also think that we have much in our lives that we can't simply change because we would like to, right? We find ourselves in different kinds of circumstances for all different kinds of reasons that have to do with all kinds of, forces in the world and decisions our parents have made and all of these kinds of things, such that I don't think that I can say that I believe in free will per se, in the sense of kind of having total freedom of choice with no constraints and no internalized influences and things like that, right? But definitely I see human agency existing. I think that we predict the future in practice all the time, right? I think that if I were to ask someone, how do you think you're going to do on the test tomorrow? They would have a sense of that, right? If you're to ask someone, well, do you think going out to the pub tonight will make you do better or worse on the test tomorrow. Like I'm talking to a younger version of myself. You know, one can probably make a prediction there too, right? Would staying home to study for the test change the outcome perhaps, you know, in a way that's different than going out to the pub would, right? That's predicting the future, ultimately, in a way that leaves room for that future to be, at least in part, determined by the decisions that one is making, right? So that's a kind of easy example that I would go to explain how I think about these things. I would also say, you know, related to that, that insofar as I'm making a prediction about the future, I am doing so at the moment of, you know, the query being made, right? A prediction may be accurate at the time, and then you go and you leave the reading table and you go and do something that completely changes, you know, what's going to happen, right? So I do think that there, for me, when I'm predicting something, there's an element of, you know, all things staying as they are now, or like continuing on the trajectory that you're talking about or that you're on now. This feels like, you know, the thing that would happen. But that's not to say that you can't do something, whether that be do something mundane or maybe do some sort of magical remediation of some sort to change that outcome, right? So yes, I predict the future. Question number 2 is, what are your boundaries? What will or won't you do? How will you respond if those boundaries are pushed? Have you ever bent or broken those boundaries? I wouldn't say that I've ever been in a scenario where someone else was getting a reading from me and they've pushed any boundary that I've had. I've overwhelmingly had positive experiences reading for people, you know, whether friends or strangers. I've never felt like I was being pressed to do anything that I was uncomfortable with, or anything like that. And so I wouldn't say I've ever broken any of my own boundaries in reading for other people. It just kind of hasn't come up. And I'm sure that if I read for others more, my answer here would be different. I do markets a couple times a year. You know, it's not, tarot is not my career. I don't run a website or like things like this where I'm constantly doing readings for other people. I'm sure it does come up and it will at some point or another, but thus far I haven't had that experience. It's hard to say what I won't do reading for other people, and what my boundaries are. I would say something specific, and again, this is something that I've never been asked to do, but something that at this point I would say that I wouldn't do would be something like mediumship, like a reading, communicating with a loved one who's passed away or something like that. Not because I don't believe that it's possible, but because I don't think of it as a skill set that I have. It's not something that I've ever tried to do. It's not something that I've ever really tried to do even for myself, except in very limited kind of ancestor practice type readings, but like not in a way that I would call something like mediumship. Like it's just never something I've done. I would not feel right suggesting that I could do that and then having someone pay me for it. At this point, I don't think I would even do that in the context of a reading with a friend. I just don't feel like I don't think I would do a good job, honestly. Is it an area that I might explore someday in future, like for myself in my personal practice? Maybe. But I also kind of don't think so. It's not an area that I have a tremendous interest in, to be quite honest. And I do think that there are people who do that kind of work, predominantly, like that is what they do. And I would rather like make a referral, you know, than try to do something like that myself, I would say. I could ramble on and try to find other examples of boundaries, but we'll just leave it there so that I don't do that. Okay. Question number 3 is, what are your disclaimers? I have never written a set of disclaimers for tarot readings. I feel like if I had a website or an Etsy shop or something like that, I would have to do something like a disclaimers page or something. I don't verbally disclaimer in any consistent way when I'm reading for others. I will say, in terms of disclaimers, I would be pretty averse to the for entertainment only disclaimer that I think, we see pretty commonly. I understand fear of or concern about being criminalized in some way, or being, legally pursued in some way. And I understand why those concerns might lead a reader to say something like, my readings are for entertainment only. I think I would personally actually feel uncomfortable doing that, because I think that when people have had readings from me, it has not been for entertainment. I don't think that has been their experience, and that has not been my experience, nor is my intention to amuse people. For the most part, I try to be a little bit funny, but that's not generally what I'm going for. I think obviously there are circumstances where it might be, if you're, maybe working a birthday party or something. I guess you could be the entertainment as a tarot reader, but it's not language that I would use to describe what I'm doing. So I would not have a disclaimer like that personally. I might on a website, or if I wrote a tarot book or something like that. I could see myself maybe, especially if a publisher was like pressing me on it, having something like, this book is not a substitute for professional medical advice or legal advice or anything like that. I also can't really see myself, for example, writing a book that could in any way be mistaken for medical advice. So it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around thinking in those terms, but maybe I would need a disclaimer like that. Maybe the closest to a disclaimer that I've given, and that I will give at times when I'm reading for others, is that I work from a perspective in which the cards answer the question that you ask. And I don't feel the need to say that, in such disclaimer-like terms all the time, but I am a pretty question-centric tarot reader. So that conversation often happens if I'm reading for someone else and they say they don't really have a question, or they don't really know what they want to ask. I will kind of have a bit of a conversation where I articulate the fact that, a general reading is completely possible and fine, and we could do like a general week ahead, or we could do, a general self-care check, or like whatever you want in that sense. But I do work from a perspective of, the more specific the question, the more specific the answer will be. I don't pressure people to articulate their question in a particular sort of a way, but I do at least try to set that kind of expectation so that someone doesn't go from having no question at all to then we've been talking for a while and it's like, oh, well, why, like, what's the answer to this? It's like, that would be another, we would have to shuffle again, right? So, like, maybe that's a disclaimer. I don't know if that counts or not, but that's what comes to mind. Now, here's the quick fire section. I'm going to just warn in advance that it's not going to be. Number 4, minimum age for a reading. I'm just going to say adult. I feel like it would be very highly unlikely for a child to be in a position to be trying to get a reading from me, just based on my friend group. There are not a lot of folks with kids in my friend group, and those who do have kids, their kids are like 20 plus. So I'm not around very young people very often. And I can't imagine at the markets that I've worked a very young child coming up to my table and trying to buy a reading. It's never come up. So I'm just going to say adult. Question number 5, under the influence, question mark. And I'm not sure here, that's why you can't do quick fire. I'm not sure here if Imogen is asking if I would read for people while I was under the influence, or if I would read for someone who is under the influence. For someone else, I don't know what you did before you sat down. I mean, unless that influence is strong, I'm probably not going to be able to tell whether someone is under the influence of something necessarily. I will say the markets that I've worked at are not, they're not events where alcohol is served. So like that hasn't been a factor so far. I would feel okay with reading for people at a party, for example, where people were, consuming substances. I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. I would not go and work at a market, for example, as I have doing readings for the public while I was inebriated. Personally, I wouldn't. Would I read for a friend at the pub when we each have a pint? Sure. Definitely. Reading in public for money, probably not. I certainly never have. So, question number 6, third-party readings. Yep, I will do a third-party reading. I have never done a reading for anyone that was like, what are they thinking about me? Like something that's that. I feel like that's the kind of thing that people think of when they think of a third-party reading, Does she love me? These kinds of things. I've never had anyone ask that kind of a question before. The reason I say that I'm fine with third-party readings is that I feel like a lot of the kinds of readings that I would do, including for myself, are third-party in some way, right? If you ask a tarot reader, will I get the job? You're ultimately asking about a hiring committee's decision. Are they going to choose you or not? Therefore, it's third-party in my mind, right? If you ask about, how to best mend a friendship or work on a relationship, like these things necessarily have third-party components to them. We are enmeshed as humans in relationships with other people, right? I think that it would, for me, be quite difficult, actually, to only read questions that have no third-party considerations or components built into them whatsoever. That feels very restrictive and very limiting, and like it would eliminate a lot of very common types of questions. Questions about office dynamics, that involves other people. Questions about relationships with your parents, that involves other people, right? I can't imagine doing that. I would also just say that, I've never done readings in the public. I feel like this would be very hard to do at a market, so I don't see it happening. But if I were to do readings for others, reading birth charts, for example, right? As someone who is informed by Hellenistic astrological techniques, third-party considerations are going to come up there unavoidably, because in Hellenistic astrology's approach to a birth chart, the chart includes information about the person's life, and that includes people in the life. That includes, being able to look at a chart and say something about someone's parents, whether someone will have long-term relationships, like romantic relationships, someone's siblings or their relationships with their siblings, their public recognition in society, maybe with respect to their career or something like that. There's a whole bunch of what could be called third-party information, because in these kind of astrological approaches, the birth chart is not the personality. It's a life, and one's life includes other people and relationships with other people. And I don't see how you couldn't tread into third party. The only way that I could say then you could do no third parties as a rule is by defining third party reading so narrowly that it's like, no, I'm not going to tell you what someone else is thinking in those terms. but totally will kind of look at it and just not think about it in those terms, and I don't like that. So third-party readings are fine in my books. Question number 7, groups or couples? That's a fun question. I have never done a reading for a group. And I have never done a reading for a couple or a partnership. I guess a group could also be a partnership, like that I wasn't in. So again, it's a thing that's just never come up. I would do a reading for a couple. I have no ethical problems with that. I would be inclined, if multiple people are going to sit down at the tarot table, and this has happened at markets and that where I've been reading for others, I will kind of check in with the person who's paying for the reading and asking the question, hey, are you comfortable with having others listen, and potentially be part of the conversation, just because things can come up, and some people have approached that as like, oh no, actually, like, hey friend, I'd rather, sit here by myself. I'll come find you later. And others have said like, oh, I actually really want my friend with me here, kind of thing. And I leave that up to the person. I'm not going to tell someone that they can't do that. And I'm also not going to, tell them that they should. I don't love like people just bringing other people as a kind of audience way. It makes it feel more performative than it is, in ways that are a little bit awkward. But yeah, I would have no tarot ethics problems with reading for couples or groups. Question number 8, medical. I would say yes and no. I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not going to give someone a diagnosis, If someone's struggling with a medical situation, do I think that I could provide a good reading, on perhaps navigating that? I think so. But I would not presume to diagnose a medical issue in the context of a tarot reading. And I will say medical is an area that I really avoid reading for myself, because I can, with the way that my anxiety brain works, veer into both hypochondria and also like fear of doctors, like just being, open about myself for a second. So I don't do medical questions for myself at all. I think it depends a little bit how the question is framed if I would do that for someone else. Question number 9, financial. I would say yes and no. I am not a credit counselor. I can't tell someone how to do a debt consolidation. Like, it's just not my skill set, and no amount of drawing cards is going to make it my skill set. Again, if somebody's dealing with some financial struggles and they're not sure, how to think about that, or it's having an emotional effect on them that they're not sure how to navigate, I think that I could do a good reading on a topic like that, and I don't have an ethical reason to not. I'm not going to tell someone what stock to invest in, right? Because I'm not, I was going to say I don't have that skill set, but also like personally, I don't do that. So I don't have anything to offer in that area, we'll say. So, yes and no. Question number 10, legal. Again, yes and no. I'm not a lawyer or a paralegal. I can't give legal advice. I do, in the context of my day job, give a lot of legal information in a specific context in which I work. So like a very particular area of law, specific to the province in which I live, but I cannot give legal advice. So I would not be giving legal advice. I do feel like I could definitely tell someone something like, hey, like the problem you're describing is actually a legal problem. And as a legal problem, you may want to seek legal advice. Like, here's some places locally that you can do that in ways that don't cost you any money. That I could provide for sure. But I can't give legal advice. I have done occasional readings about predicting potential outcomes of legal processes without providing any legal advice. And I have no ethical problem with that either, really. again, I'm not going to pretend that I have expertise that I don't. And I'm not going to present myself in a way that I could be misconstrued as like representing myself as being a lawyer or something like that, right? But like on legal topics, I don't have a problem with that. Question number 11, do you or have you ever charged for a reading? How much? When did you start? And refunds, question mark. I charge for readings when I read for the public. I started doing that, it would be maybe 3 years ago now. Again, it's not a super frequent occurrence. I charge on a sliding scale. I live in an area that, a lot of people are working class people. There's, financial barriers for lots of things. So I do a sliding scale, and the way that I've priced it is to be a small reading or a large reading in terms of number of cards. I don't do time. I know some people do by minutes, but like I can't keep to a time to save my life. So I'm not going to put that pressure on myself in that way. So I'll do a kind of like a 3-card reading and a 6-card reading or something like that. And they'll be priced differently, but they are sliding scale. I have never given anyone a refund, and I don't think I would. I think the only scenario where I could imagine giving a refund for a tarot reading, and I don't anticipate this coming up, is that if I had an Etsy shop where I offered readings, for example, and somebody purchased one at a time where I meant to have my shop on hold and I was like unable to complete the service in some reason, then of course I would have no problem giving someone their money back. They didn't get the thing that they asked for. I would not be inclined to refund someone's money because they just didn't like the answer that they got, right? And maybe that's another disclaimer, that there's a potential disclaimer in a conversation when you're having a reading with someone is, again, the cards answer the question. Like, is the answer to the question an answer that you want? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? I'm not into pressuring people to reword their questions to suit me. But sometimes that conversation might change someone's mind. If it's like, oh, I actually, like, that's not exactly the answer that I'm looking for. What I'm actually looking to know is this. And someone will kind of rephrase their question themselves. So I think, that's something. Question number 12. What are your qualifications, skills, and experience? So I have never done a tarot certification or anything like that. I have been reading tarot for a long time. I have been reading for myself for a very long time. I've been reading for others for a slightly less long time. I have taken a number of tarot workshops, attended a conference which had some workshops at it as well. I have spent time with other readers, learning from each other and, swapping techniques and practice readings and things like that. And I would also say in terms of skills, I'm a multi-system person. So in terms of skills, I have tarot skills, but I also have Oracle, OM, geomancy, astrology skills. Some of which, I've built up over the course of taking classes, through independent study and reading and practice and learning. I, in tarot context, would say that I have proficiency in reading Marseille and Smith-Waite influenced kinds of decks. I've never studied Thoth, so that's not a skill that I have in particular. And yeah, those are my qualifications. And I have some experience reading in public settings as well. Question number 13 is continuing professional development. How do you keep learning? I keep reading, like reading cards for myself, for other people. I keep reading books. I love a tarot book. I have no doubt that I will take more workshops, here and there. I really like a workshop space where you can talk with other readers and, maybe exchange practice readings and get different people's perspectives on how they would interpret different things. I really like these kind of structured learning environments, especially if they're done well. I will never stop. that. Like I will never be at a point where I'm like, I know tarot, I don't need to do that anymore, because I just find it so enjoyable. I'm clearly a student at heart in lots of areas. I would also say in terms of continuing professional development though, in the context of a tarot ethics conversation and reading for other people, that keeping learning also has to mean things like learning about inequalities, learning about systemic power relations, learning about current events and being like up on current events, learning about the world, right? Learning about, cultural diversity, learning about all of these things that shape people's lives, that people experience in different ways. Learning about positionality and social location and all of these kinds of things, because to read for other people, in a way that does justice to the question that they're asking and in a way that is responsible, I feel like you need to have that continuing learning about the world, because you're reading to answer questions of, potentially dilemmas or struggles or concerns that people have in the context of the world that they're in, right? In the position that they're in that world. And so I think that, learning to read tarot well for others in an ethical way is never just about how good at interpreting cards on the fly that you are, That's maybe part of it. But, there's also learning about how to hold space for someone who may become very upset, or who may be asking about something that is very difficult. There's also, learning about resources that are available in your community, so that if it becomes clear that someone is, asking something that suggests that they might need a resource that isn't you, being able to, maybe have these kinds of, not referrals, but like contact information for different kinds of things that might come up that someone would need. That's learning too. I think all of those things are important. Question number 14, how do you manage confidentiality? I just don't talk about people's shit. And, I just do. I'm used to maintaining confidentiality. Any job that I've had as an adult has required me to do so. So it's not like a new concept for me to think confidentially, just as a way of approaching things. If I'm talking about readings that I've done for someone else on my YouTube channel, for example, I would only do that in an anonymous way. Like, oh, me and my friend swapped readings and we used these spreads or whatever. Like that feels okay to me. But I'm not going to put someone's personal information out there, in that kind of context. In terms of practical, tangible stuff, when I'm reading at the market, I do tend to get the person who runs the markets to set me up at a table that's kind of separate from the rest, just because the space can be kind of loud, and it does create this little bit of a buffer such that if someone's asking questions, we're having a conversation, that they're not so easily overheard by random people that are just wandering around. And the person who organizes the market is a tarot reader herself. So, she kind of does, I don't have to ask her to do that. It's just something that she thinks about. We try to make a private space in that way. It is visible. The person knows that when they're sitting down, of course, but we try our best to make sure that they can have what feels like a privacy respecting experience. I also don't write down people's names or anything like that when I'm reading in public, like to keep track of who my tarot clients have been or anything like that. And I don't have like a mailing list or these kinds of things where I would be having people's personal information databased in any kind of way. So like those considerations just don't apply to my work right now. Question number 15, have you or would you ever upsell other products and services during a reading? No and no, definitely not. When I'm reading at the market, I'll have my table with my, where I'm reading the cards on. And if there's space, I'll usually have a little table beside, and I will have some decks, like gently used decks, and books and things like that will be for sale that people can just kind of browse, like whether they're getting a reading from me or not, people can look at those. I don't try to upsell them in the context of providing a reading though. They're just kind of there. I'm not selling anything else. Like I don't have anything else to upsell with really. So, and I've never suggested somebody pay for a second reading. I've never done that. So no. Question number 16. Is it important to you to keep your readings objective / non-judgmental? How do you manage biases and projection? So I'm going to try to not word quibble too much here, but I have feelings. I'll say that I think for me, non-judgmental and objective are very different. They're very different. Do I try to make a reading objective? No. Not in the sense, like, I don't read from a bird's eye view. I am a person, with identities who lives in the world, who has a particular outlook on the world, and that is going to come through in a reading with me, right? And I think that that's actually an asset. I don't think that, pretending that all of my particularities don't exist and trying to abstract out and keep myself out of the reading, I actually don't think that's helpful. And I think for the most part, considering the nature of the events that I've worked at and who my friends are who want readings from me, I don't think that's something that would be wanted. So objective, no. Non-judgmental, I think, is a bit different. I would say that I aspire to be non-judgmental in the sense that, if someone's asking about whether they should stay in a relationship, for example, right? It's like, I don't feel like it's my place, and here I'm thinking of examples where like this person is a stranger to me. I don't think it's my place to put personal judgments on what little snippets of information someone has given me about their relationship for the most part, right? And I think the only way to manage something like that, like the only way to try to be a non-judgmental reader, like this question is like, how do you manage biases? Like I feel particular about the word bias, so I'm not going to use it here. How do you manage judgmentalness? I would say that that's a question that's independent of tarot reading, actually, that you need to cultivate being a non-judgmental person in general if you want to read tarot in a non-judgmental way. Because if you're a super judgmental person, you're going to be judgmental in all of the things that you're doing, including reading tarot for other people. So that to me is not even a tarot practice thing, really. Yeah. I would say I could also refer back here, just to say a little bit more, I could refer back to here the kind of continued professional development and learning piece. In terms of managing judgmentalness or mitigating bias, I think a lot of that also has to do with learning and unlearning, right? Like unlearning the narratives that you have learned about particular groups of people, for example, right? Unlearning stereotypes that may be very commonly held in the social context in which you live. Those kind of things I think are really important in terms of being, non-judgmental and being a good, effective reader for diverse people, who are going to come to you in a public space. But I don't think that's about like reading technique so much as it is about being a human in the world. And I don't think it's a thing you can only do about tarot. It has to be for everything else too. Question number 17. What do you consider to be sensitive topics? I think that is so personal, and I think that I approach every reading as if something could be a sensitive topic. If people don't usually come and ask questions about things that they have no personal investment in, or that they don't feel care for, or importance to in some way. And really anything can be sensitive, right? Like something is not necessarily sensitive to me, but the topic of siblings could be very sensitive to someone if they've perhaps lost a sibling or they're estranged from a sibling. The topic of a relationship could be very sensitive if someone's just had a breakup or are experiencing in a relationship that's abusive. Pregnancy could be a really sensitive topic. Child loss could be a really sensitive topic. Parents could be a really sensitive topic. Finances could be a very, 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 very sensitive topic. Debt could be a sensitive topic. I assume that a topic that someone is asking about may be something sensitive, and I try to navigate the conversation in a way that respects that, while allowing exploring that topic in a way that the person feels comfortable, but without making presumptions about how comfortable or not comfortable, or how sensitive or non-sensitive a particular thing might be for someone to talk about. I think it's just better to proceed that way, with care. Finally, question number 18, how do you handle difficult readings? And the two examples of difficult readings that are given are A, bad cards, and B, can't understand the cards. I've never had a can't understand the cards experience, reading for others, actually. I definitely have had readings that come easier or slower or faster to me when the cards, come up. Sometimes what I want to say feels really, really obvious, like nearly immediately. Sometimes I need to kind of pause for a bit and look at things and maybe talk out what I'm seeing a little bit, but I can't say I've ever had a can't understand the cards moment. And this may just have to do with the fact that I didn't start reading for other people I didn't start reading for other people that weren't friends or family. Like, I didn't start reading for strangers until I had been reading for myself and for friends and family for what I think is probably a very long time, compared to many other readers. So I just haven't had that experience. In terms of bad cards, I'll say that some of this for me comes down to deck choice. And I got out the deck that I have in my bag right now that I kind of carry around. I always have one or sometimes more with me, is Lubanco Tarot. This is not a deck that I have read with at the market, and I don't know that it's one that I would, which is not to say I wouldn't use it for others, but thinking about quote unquote bad cards, I do kind of try to pick decks that don't have imagery that might be like really, really re-traumatizing for anyone. So this deck has a little bit, I would say, more gore in it than I would incline towards bringing to a market. I let people touch the decks that I bring and look through them and make a choice about which one they would like. I tend to try to bring ones that don't have, there are some really challenging cards in Lubanco Tarot. I really love the deck, but I wouldn't incline to springing it on a stranger. Because there are cards in there that if they came up, I think could really upset someone. Similarly, I don't tend towards bringing decks that have a lot of really overt kind of Pope Christian heavy imagery in them, because I think that a lot of us have religious trauma, right? I don't believe that there are bad cards, and I think Imogen put bad cards in scare quotes in the question here. I don't believe that there are bad cards in the deck. I do think that particular decks can have some depictions that a client who's not familiar with tarot could see and very readily react, that's bad. And in some ways, those kinds of decks are just not what I pick. But even a deck, what decks have I brought lately? I've been bringing to read for other people. I've brought Dreaming Way a lot, and people always pick it. I've read with Neo Tarot, which I actually ended up rehoming at one of the markets, but I've read with that one for the public. I've read with Fifth Spirit. I've read with, what else did I take? I can't remember what decks I took the last time. I tend to try to have a bit of a range in terms of art style, right? But there are definitely a couple decks where I'm like, that's a challenge. If something comes up, I will say also on this theme, as if I haven't rambled enough, I don't read with decks with keywords for the public. And I mostly don't read with decks with keywords for myself too much. I have a few, like Wildwood, like there's a couple, but people's eye goes to the keyword way too quickly. So if a card says despair on it, even though as a tarot reader, like, we all know that that card can have a whole bunch of different kinds of meanings, and you have to interpret it in the context of the question, in the context of the spread position if you have one. I don't want to be turning over something that someone's going to look at it and see it like it's a flashcard that says despair, when they've asked me about their upcoming nuptials. Like I do not want that. So I don't do keyword decks in public for that reason. If a difficult card comes up that a client looks at and thinks, ooh, I will often just kind of ask them what they're thinking, like ask them what they're seeing, ask them if they have an initial impression. And usually, if it's a 3-card reading, there'll be one card that they're really fixated on potentially. And we'll talk about that, and we'll say, and then we'll go to, okay, but, looking at the larger context and thinking about the question that you asked, we can talk this through and find the answer, right? And I'm pretty conversational in how I read with other people as well. I do ask people what they see or what they think, if they would like to share something that they think, and often they have something that's really, relevant and interesting, and it takes the conversation forward. Yeah, I've never had anyone full on panic that they were going to die or something because the 10 of Swords came up. I've never had that kind of interaction. I would say a lot of the people who come to me for readings are people who are maybe beginner tarot enthusiasts or have some level of fluency themselves. And so that also changes the conversation a lot. Yeah, I just try to, again, navigate so-called bad cards with care, right? And I've never had any reading go like really negatively because a particular card came up. So I think I'm doing a pretty good job there. That is Tarot Ethics. Thank you so much, Imogen, for starting this tag. I really hope that other people will answer. I have had a lot of fun thinking about these questions, and I look forward to watching some more VRs. Thanks for watching, and have a great day. Bye.